that's enough of that. All right, so this is going to be part one of the lecture on Nazi Germany. Our main goals: to identify at least 4 ways that Hitler's Nazi Germany was anti-liberal, or a new term that I'm going to introduce today is illiberal. Now, illiberal is when you do non-democratic methods in a supposed democratic country. Okay, so when Hitler is doing things in the Third Reich, that is not considered to be illiberal. Now, if you're in a democracy or a republic like Canada or the United States, and the government does things that are not democratic in nature, not liberal in nature, then that would be illiberal. Now, to be specific and technical, when Hitler takes over in January 1933 and he proceeds to dismantle the Weimar Republic, with the passage of the various acts, the Enabling Act, for example, fire decrees, that would be now considered illiberal. But that's a technicality. We're going to describe the circumstances under which people found the ideologies of communism or fascism appealing. We already looked at the Russian Revolution in the last lesson. Now we're going to look at fascism in Germany. Is authoritarianism a necessary condition for the rejection of liberalism? Okay, do you need to have an autocratic leader, a dictatorship, in order to completely reject liberalism? And finally, will the rejection of liberalism always lead to failure, as it did with Nazi Germany? We have looked at a number of case studies. You guys have looked at a number of other case studies of dictatorships. Does it lead to failure? Obviously, what happened in Nazi Germany led to failure. Eventually, what happens in the Soviet Union leads to a collapse. But does it always necessarily lead to that? All right, we've looked at this a number of times. You'll see that communism is to the left. Now, according to this chart, fascism is to the right. I would argue that fascism, yes, it advocates the private ownership of the means of production, but they practice something called the corporatist state, in which the government directs private enterprise. So I wouldn't call it a mixed economy or anything like that, but in a lot of ways, it's like an oligopoly. Okay, preferential treatment as long as you do what the government tells you what to do. Fascism certainly preaches elitism, that there's just some people better than others. But if you look at dictatorship of the proletariat under communism, there was also an elite group. Okay, in theory, communism preaches collectivism, but they were certainly authoritarian, especially under that said dictatorship of the proletariat. Like I said, is fascism always private enterprise? I would argue it's a corporate estate. And do some research on what a corporate estate is, and try to compare that to private enterprise, and you'll see that there are quite a few differences. All right. Another question that maybe you should think about as we go along here is, why do you think dictatorships are placed on the opposite extremes on a lot of political spectrums? Why would communists and fascists, in theory, be completely separate, but in practice, they're very similar? Like I said, on a number of occasions, I prefer this so-called horseshoe type spectrum, which shows that when you go to the extremes, whether right or left, you're now leaving political freedom towards political control. And so, in many ways, they're very similar on those extremes. Whereas in the center, now you have democracy, liberalism, freedom, ranging from left socialism to right conservatism. All right, there's Mr. Hitler, kind of in his standard day-to-day wear. One of the things you'll notice that's different about what Hitler wears versus what some of these, Soviet leaders wore, is that Hitler was a lot more understated in type of the uniforms he'd wear, etc. But how did he become a dictator? Now, one of the things you'll find out is that he did not take power through some sort of overthrow, coup d'etat, violent uprising. It wasn't a revolution. He gained power through constitutional means, and then from those constitutional means, he was able to consolidate that power. So yes, it became a dictatorship through legal means. Here's a picture of Hitler on the outbreak of World War I believe in August of 1914. He's in a Munich square. It's kind of extraordinary that they were able to find him in this picture. But yeah, he was an Austrian who had immigrated to uh, southern Germany, taken up in the German Republic, or not, German Empire, and enlisted in the German army. He saw himself more as a German than an Austrian. This is a picture of him as Time Man of the Year sometime in the mid 1930s after their reindustrialization. The Nazis' advocacy of law and order appealed to many Germans who were tired of the years of instability, post World War I between 1919 and 1933. They were marked by a number of economic recessions, depressions. So let's just go back in history. Prior to World War I, here's a couple pictures. The first guy is Otto von Bismarck. The second guy is the Kaiser, the Emperor Wilhelm II. This is a picture of Kaiser Wilhelm firing Otto von Bismarck in the late 1890s. Germany had a long and proud military history. Most of Germany was made up of the section called Prussia. Germany had an authoritarian system ruled by, like I said, Kaisers, a derivative of the word emperor, very similar to a czar, which is another derivative of the word emperor. Wilhelm I, followed by, I believe, his grandson, Wilhelm II. The chancellor or prime minister, the person that ran the day-to-day operations of the government, the first said chancellor was Otto von Bismarck, ran Germany until the late 1800s, until he was fired by Wilhelm. They minimized the desire to move towards a liberal democracy by introducing social reforms, kind of like a precursor to the welfare state. Limited healthcare, old age insurance, accident and disability insurance. Therefore, many Germans saw the old regime, this old autocracy, as benevolent, caring, and just. Okay, is this kind of like I said, a precursor to the welfare state that Germany was instituting prior to World War I. However, they lose in World War I, and for the first time ever, Germany now becomes a republic, the Weimar Republic. The Kaiser flees to Holland. The empire is gone. They have to pay, the price for losing in World War I with the Peace of Paris and the Versailles Treaty, etc. There is a German parliament. It's called the Reichstag. They're elected through universal suffrage, so people under or over a certain age are allowed to vote. This era from 1919 to 1933 in Germany was known as the Weimar. Weimar is the a city, I believe, that was housing to the parliament at that time. Okay, like I said, the Weimar Republic, for all intents and purposes, ends of just a few months after Hitler takes over in 1933. All right, just going into review, the Treaty of Versailles kind of ushers in the Weimar Republic, but this is what happened to Germany. Germany was treated rather harshly as far as the terms of the treaty. Their army was held to less than 100,000 men and no tanks. Their navy was reduced to basically nothing, no submarines, no air force, I mean, Wehrmacht, Kriegsmarine, Marine, Luftwaffe, a section of Western Germany that they had taken with the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 was returned to France. That section is called Alsace and Lorraine. Germany loses all its colonies, especially the African colonies. The area of Western Germany called the Rhineland becomes demilitarized, so they cannot have any kind of military installations or military people there in that area west of the Rhine River towards the French-Belgian border. They are not allowed to combine with Austria. So that combination is forbidden under the Versailles Treaty. It would make them too strong as far as a Central European power. Germany was forced to recognize the new states of Poland and Czechoslovakia that had been taken out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I mean, Poland is a traditional country for hundreds and hundreds of years, but they had been kind of amalgamated by Prussia and Russia. But after World War I, they gained their independence. And Germany, probably the most embarrassing of all, had to sign something called a war guilt clause, the so-called Diktat, which primarily placed the blame of the start and the engagement of World War I on them. And it became just a huge amount of embarrassment for the people of Germany. Specifically, it was a rallying cry for the Nazis as they became more and more powerful. Finally, they had to pay something called reparations, and reparations are basically repairing for the cost of damages that occurred during World War I. And that sum at the time was $33 billion US. Eventually, they only paid only 713 million of that 33 billion. Even though Germany had little choice in signing the treaty, much of the German population blamed the government, the Weimar Republic, for the humiliation and economic hardship the treaty was a cause for years to come. This resentment would undermine the confidence in this liberal democratic government. If you think about it, if your government is born out of defeat, it's pretty hard to establish confidence with the people. They're always going to long for the so-called good old days. Okay. Furthermore, many Germans associated liberalism with the countries that defeated them in World War I. Well, liberalism is the type of government system that's practiced by the British and the French and the Americans. Why would we want a government system like them? All right. So, like I said, one of the big things that you need to understand is that there was an economic turmoil that occurred in not only Germany, but most of the world during the 1920s. After World War I, the German economy was in ruins. They had spent years fighting in wars. Now they had to pay these reparation payments. Germany had trouble with the so-called reparation payments, and massive inflation saw savings being wiped out. 1923 hyperinflation, and we'll talk about that in a second. But one of the things that occurred in 1923 is that they wanted to pay for their reparation payments. And so they pumped too much money into the system. They printed too much money, and that devalued the worth of currency. Okay. And so that kind of created a snowball effect where the worth of the German mark went from a certain amount to basically nothing over a period of a couple years. Hyperinflation plagued Germany as it tried to pay off its war reparations. The number of marks on this example equals $1 American dollar. So in 1918, and I'm just going to show this to you. I don't need to read all this to you, but in 1918, 8.25 German marks equaled $1 American dollar. So here we go. You can see how hyperinflation works here. By 1923, so 5 years after World War I, where it started at 8.25 to 1, now it's 111,000 to 1. And you can see by September, 99 million. October, 25 billion. November, crazy number, 2.1 trillion to 1, 4.2 trillion to 1. Okay, you can't even fathom the difference in the worth of the mark from 1918 until December 1923. And so you can see they basically just started burning it because it was cheaper than paper. So what you see here is that a number of individuals stepped in to try to save Germany and their economic system. The chancellor at that time, Gustav Stresemann, was able to negotiate a deal with various American financiers and came up with the Dawes Plan and then eventually the Young Plan. Both these individuals, I believe, were in the United States administration at that time. The gist of this was that the Americans would say, okay, we will help you repay your loans, we will help you structure your reparations, we'll reset your German mark, and so that you're on a kind of a payment plan. It's like you're going into a bank and getting a consolidation loan, and okay, we'll give you a cheaper or a better interest rate. You can pay it over a number of years. From what I understand, the Young Plan or the Dawes Plan was set to be repaid over about 50 years or more, 50 or 60 years. It wasn't even supposed to end until I think my professor at university once said the mid 1980s. Also, in the mid 1920s, because of the stability that was occurring in Europe post World War One, there became this kind of peaceful relation between former foes, in which Britain, France, Germany all started to get along much better. This era was called the Locarno era. It was marked by a few agreements, peace treaties. Well, things like that can happen when there's stability. Stability can breed democracy, liberalism. Things are all right. One of the things I've said over and over again, though, is if as long as stability is there, you can have liberalism and democracy. But once that's lost, then people want that security once again. Okay. Yes, Germany was on the upswing through the 1920s into the later 1920s, but would it last? And I would argue, no, it did not. When the Weimar Republic failed to provide Germans with any hope in hard times, they looked back to authoritarian rule. So, yes, when things are good, people are fine. But when the Great Depression really hits in the late 1920s, people want that stability once again. Hitler, who was unpopular in the mid 1920s, suddenly became popular again once the Great Depression hits in 1929 into the early 1930s. Hitler's Nazi Party promoted absolute nationalism, ultranationalism, like you learned in Social 20, which called for the unification of all German speakers. That would include the Germans that lived in Austria. That would include the Germans that lived in the western portion of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. Use paramilitary troops, so troops or military that was outside of the normal German military, the Wehrmacht, so to speak, to stifle dissent and to terrorize the opposition, the so-called brown shirts, the SA, and wanted to centralize decision making into a single leader to whom everyone owed loyalty. Another example of a cult of personality, not unlike what Stalin had created in the Soviet Union. Nazi Party starts to win over voters with promises too. Revive authoritarian rule through military law and order. Once again, people would want stability and order and security more than they want freedom. And I probably should backtrack just a little bit and explain how does Germany get involved in this Great Depression? Well, because American financial institutions, businesses, corporations, etc., invested so heavily in Germany in the mid 1920s, when the Great Depression started occurring in the United States, they withdrew their support. And since their financial support was heavily invested in the United States, once the United States economy went down because of the stock market crash and the subsequent Great Depression, it affected Germany. And since Germany's economy was so much weaker then the American economy beforehand, the Great Depression affected them even more. And so they were very vulnerable to any kind of autocratic takeover. They didn't have 125, 150 years of democracy behind them like America did. Germany had basically 12 years of the Weimar Republic, and it wasn't 12 successful years. Whereas the United States, they had been a republic, a democracy, ever since they kicked the British out in 1776, and they've been practicing basically that for generations prior to that too. So, anyways, Nazi Germany wanted to abolish the Treaty of Versailles. They saw it as an albatross around their neck, so to speak. They wanted to promote and revive German nationalism. Once again, ultra nationalistic. They wanted to revive the military. The Wehrmacht was only allowed to have 100,000 soldiers, not enough to defend themselves. So they were going to break that promise with the Versailles Treaty. They wanted to offer protection of the Christian religion by the state. They were going to have a state church. They were going to confiscate all personal profit made off of World War I. Deny citizenship of anyone not of the German race, which they eventually did through the Nuremberg Laws of 1935. All citizens must work to be physically and spiritually pure. Okay, it's an example of doing your part. It's actually an example of how collective in nature the fascists were. All citizens should have access to education and healthcare. Once again, another example of how they were a little collective in nature. All profits from factories will be shared by all citizens. Notice my little star there. This promise obviously was never adhered to. Okay, fascists, in most spectrums are seen as extreme right, but they have many collective ideals. I mean, the name themselves is the National Socialist German Workers' Party. National Socialist German Workers' Party. All right. So in review, Hitler's rise to power. 1923, a failed coup d'etat, the so-called Munich Putsch or Beer Hall Putsch. They tried to take over the country through a military takeover. It failed. He spends the next 9 months in prison, writes his famous book, Mein Kampf, Mein Struggle. He realizes because of this failure in 1923 that he has to gain power legitimately. He can't take it over like the communists did in Russia. He has to take it over legally. After the stock market crash of 29, the economic crisis leads more people to listen to his solution. Between 24 and 29, the Nazis were not very popular, and that was because because of the Dawes and Young plans and American financing. Germany was propped up at least for those few years. Once the bottom fell out because of the Great Depression, his popularity and his party's popularity rose. By 1933, the Nazis have the most seat in the German Weimar Republic, the so-called Reichstag, and eventually Hitler is named chancellor, even though the president at that time, Hindenburg, despised Hitler, saw him as a bourgeois, bohemian corporal. Corporal is the rank that he achieved in World War I. Hated him. But he basically had no choice. He named him chancellor. Once becoming chancellor, he sets out in consolidating his power and turning the Weimar Republic into the Third Reich. Like I said, a month later, the Reichstag burns down mysteriously. They say it was a communist sympathizer who did it, but many people believe that it was an example of a false flag, in which the Nazis burned it down and then blamed it on the communists, gave them the opportunity to, secure their country. The Nazis claim it was work of communists. Hitler has the president at that time sign the Enabling Act of March 1933. Okay, and once the Enabling Act is signed, it gives the German government, the Nazis, temporary power over the next number of years, I think 4 years, in order to run the country like a police state. Now, here's a question. If you give your government the right to rule you as a police state for 4 or 5 years, what would stop them from continuing to do so? Okay, it's one of these things where once you give up your power, good luck ever getting it back. Here's a picture of the SA, the so-called stormtroops, the thugs, led by Ernst Röhm, who were eventually gotten rid of and amalgamated into the German army in 1934. Here's a picture of the SS, the so-called elite group set up by Heinrich Himmler that eventually took over as the main paramilitary group from the SA. So November 1932, the Nazi Party held 1/3 of the seats in the Reichstag. They actually never held a majority of the seats in the Reichstag. By 1933, Hitler was named chancellor, which I have already mentioned. Ironically, the government agreed as they thought Hitler posed no real threat and could be easily manipulated. Hitler was a great speaker, but I think a lot of people underestimated what he would do once he got into power. He capitalized on the situation and quickly turned Germany into a totalitarian state. So from January 33, when he takes over, until about the middle of 1933, he turns it from a republic, a liberal democracy, into a dictatorship. So within a number of months, the fire in the Reichstag was used by Hitler to spread the fear of a communist takeover. Although it is believed that Nazis actually started the fire, which I called a false flag, he used the incident to solidify his power. So, in the course of the next few months in 1933, he starts to purge or get rid of his opposition. Anybody that belonged to another political party that was in the Reichstag, he got rid of them. The people that spoke out against him, he eventually would get rid of, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. When President Hindenburg himself dies a year later, he amalgamates the two positions of president and chancellor and becomes the Fuhrer, the leader. While individual rights suffered, the economy, and so this is one of the reasons why people allowed this, or at least in the beginning, is that he actually helped the economy. 6 million Germans were unemployed in 1933, but by 1936, only 1 million were unemployed. Okay, so a lot of people would see that as success. Foreign imports were restricted to promote German products designed to achieve what is called autarky. Okay, so I guess is like a precursor to protectionism, Germany first or German first, so to speak. This is just a map or a chart that just shows some of the post-World War I problems. If you look at the top map, it shows how Germany was broken up post-World War I. Don't think I have a thing where I can do a pointer. But as you can see, the Rhineland is the area of Western Germany that was not militarized. The Ruhr was an area that the French came in from time to time to take over the industrial sectors to help pay for the reparations. You can see how Germany was split into two. You have Germany, and then on the eastern portion, you have East Prussia. They wanted to give Poland access to the ocean, so they called it the Polish Corridor. That was another thing that Hitler hated about the Versailles Treaty. Hitler in his book, now we go on the bottom map, in his book Mein Kampf, he talks about Lebensraum, this living space. He talks about eventually how he wants to move Germans into Russia, into the Ukraine, and use the resources at their disposal. So yeah, you can look at this in your own, you can pause this, whatever you want. Here's a diagram talking about the structure of the Weimar Republic. Once again, you don't need to know the ins and outs of this, but basically it was broken up into, the president, you have the chancellor, you have the Reichstag, and all that. So your typical liberal democratic government in which eventually Hitler and the Nazis amalgamate and turn into a dictatorship by, like I said, the middle of 1933. All right. It's another video. You can follow the link on this in the slide presentation if you want to watch. It's called Life Under Hitler. Pretty good little 20-minute video that talks about living in Nazi Germany during that time period. Okay, talked about the Reichstag fire already. I believe that was January 1933. I call it a false flag. Blame it on the communists. Okay. Uh, Eventually, the communists were banned from the Reichstag or arrested. Any other political affiliation, they were gotten rid of. And so basically, the Reichstag became the Nazi Party. So let's just talk about this Enabling Act of 1933 real quick. Passed in March of 33. Okay, its formal name, the law to remedy the distress of the people and the nation. Helped Hitler get closer to his goal of achieving full control over the German parliament. Although many members of the parliament disagreed with the idea of Enabling Act, the military influence of Hitler's SA forced them to change their minds. I mean, they were basically said, if you don't vote for this, we're just going to beat the living crap out of you. Okay. It granted Hitler the right to enact laws without consulting German parliament for a period of 4 years. So in other words, the executive had the right to do whatever they wanted for a period of 4 years without legislative approval. The same thing would be if the prime minister and his cabinet in Canada could do whatever they wanted without parliament. And some would argue, well, they already can do that. Well, you might be right to a certain extent with that. In the United States, if the president could just enact executive order, executive order, executive order without consulting, the House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate. Form the legal and constitutional basis of the Third Reich, because Hitler would always say that this Enabling Act gave him legitimacy, justification for his regime. He wasn't just a bunch of thugs. It encouraged the dissolving of all parties other than the Nazi Party and formed the platform for his dictatorship. So remember how the Enabling Act was the legislation that turned Germany, the Weimar Republic, into Nazi Germany. All right, so he also passed the Fire Decree, which came right around the same time as the Enabling Act. Basically, it restricted your personal freedom, your freedom of opinion, freedom of the press, freedom of organization, freedom of assembly. It eliminated the privacy of mail, of telegrams, phone conversations. It eliminated the need for warrants to conduct searches. And you were able to pass legislation through the office of the chancellor without the approval of the Reichstag. So in other words, extreme executive power. All political parties except for the Nazi Party was banned. The strict enforcement of law and order gave people a sense of security. Transportation improved, rallies and propaganda brought hope and confidence. Like I said, one of the main slogans was Hitler is my mother and my father. He keeps me safe from all harm. One of the things that dictatorships will do is that they'll replace the family unit and they will be, in fact, the de facto parent. One last thing that occurred in order to consolidate power was the so-called Night of the Long Knives. Now, Hitler had a number of enemies, and also, I wouldn't call them friends, but allies that had helped him rise to power. He needed to consolidate his power in order to become the Fuhrer. So at the end of June of 1934 and the start of July in 1934, Hitler was able to, and the Nazis were able to consolidate their power by eliminating these so-called threats to power. Hitler moved against the stormtroopers and its leader Ernst Röhm because he saw them as a threat to his power. There were 4 million of these people in the SA. He saw them as a threat. So basically, he said to the military and he said to other people, if I can get rid of the SA and if I can get rid of Ernst Röhm, I want you to swear allegiance to me. And so from that point on until the end of World War II, the German military, the Wehrmacht, was loyal to Hitler. And so they got rid of Ernst Röhm. Ernst Röhm was told he had to kill himself. He eventually did not kill himself, so the SS killed him. A number of other threats to Hitler's power, and then people that Hitler just wanted to get rid of were murdered on this weekend in 1934. This is similar to what Stalin did with his purges. Over 100 people were killed for political reasons by the SS and the Gestapo, the secret police, and more than 1,000 were arrested. Okay, and so this event was called Night of the Long Knives. Like I had already said, when President Hindenburg dies in 1934, basically a month or two after this Night of the Long Knives, Hitler just consolidates the office of Chancellor and the President and titles himself Der Führer. Hitler, like Stalin, created this cult of personality, which made him, not even human-like anymore, but more like God-like, someone to be worshipped, someone to be revered. Every soldier in the SS swore a personal oath of loyalty, not to Germany itself, but to Adolf Hitler. I swear to you, Adolf Hitler, this was the oath, as Führer and Chancellor of the German Reich, loyalty and valor. I pledge to you and to your superiors, whom you will appoint, obedience unto death. So, in summary, Hitler becomes Chancellor in 33. The Reichstag fire gives him and the Nazis opportunity to consolidate power. They soon pass the Enabling Act of March 1933. Over time, as they consolidate power, it leads to the Night of the Long Knives in June, July of 1934, where many of the political opponents and threats to Hitler are eliminated. Eventually, President Hindenburg dies of old age. Hitler amalgamates the two positions in the Weimar Republic and entitles himself Der Führer. He becomes the dictator, the extreme leader of the German Reich at that point. Like I said, how do you turn a democracy into a dictatorship? Well, Hitler did it over the course of about a year and a half. So I believe that's going to be the end of my part one for today. I will talk about part two tomorrow. So until then, see you later.